The cold of the unforgiving city night seeped through the thin glass of the motel window, a tangible presence in the stale air that smelled of bleach and despair. Liam sat on the edge of a lumpy bed, the springs groaning in protest under his weight. On the small scratch table beside him lay his entire world, flattened under the dim, yellow light of a single lamp, a small stack of worn bills. He counted them for the 10th time, his calloused fingers, once so skilled with wood and nail, now clumsy and trembling. $800. A gut-wrenching finality settled in his chest as he stared at the number. This was it. The last of the money from selling his tools, the last buffer between his daughter and the streets. His disabled leg throbbed with a dull, familiar ache, a constant reminder of the day his life had splintered. He glanced over at the other bed, where his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, slept fitfully, her small chest rising and falling in a shallow, worrying rhythm. He felt his heart tighten, a cold, hard knot of fear and failure, a feeling that had become as constant as his own breathing. It felt like another lifetime when these hands built things. Liam closed his eyes, and for a second he could almost smell the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut pine and sawdust. He remembered the solid weight of a hammer, the satisfaction of driving a nail home with a single, perfect strike. He had been a creator, a carpenter who could turn lumber into a home. Then came the fall, the sickening crack of a scaffold, the brief, weightless flight, and the shattering impact that stole his trade. The disability payments had been a lifeline, but a temporary one. The final letter, with its cold, bureaucratic language, had felt like a death sentence. Benefits concluded. 2 words that pushed them off a cliff. He sold everything of value. His truck went first, then the tools, each one feeling like a piece of his soul being auctioned off. He could still feel the shame burning in his ears as the eviction notice was taped to their apartment door, the pitying looks from neighbors as they carried their life out in cardboard boxes. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. He felt like a ghost, erased from his own life. A soft wheezing sound pulled Liam back to the grim reality of the motel room. It was Maya. He listened intently, his entire body tensed. Every breath she took was a battle. Her chronic asthma was a constant, shadowy threat, and the city's cold, damp air was its most powerful ally. In his pocket, his fingers found the cold plastic of her emergency inhaler, a talisman he never let out of his reach. He saw her small form stir under the thin blanket. She was trying so hard to be brave for him, he knew. She'd stopped asking when they could go home. Her questions replaced by a quiet watchfulness that broke his heart. He remembered her last bad attack just 2 weeks ago, the terrifying, high-pitched whistle of her struggle for air, her wide, panicked eyes looking to him for a rescue he barely managed to provide. The memory made his throat tighten with unshed tears. It was one thing to fail himself, but to fail her, to be the reason she was sick, the reason she was scared. It was an unbearable weight, a crushing fusion of fierce, protective love and a crippling, all-consuming fear. The number taunted him from the table. $800. The motel room was $75 a night. He did the grim math in his head again. 10 nights. Less, really, when you factored in food. A week, maybe a week and a half, before the money was gone. Utterly and completely gone. Then what? The thought of a homeless shelter, of the disease and violence he'd heard about. That was horrifying. The thought of sleeping on the street with Maya, trying to shield her from the cold with his own body, was a physical blow that left him breathless. Outside the window, a distant siren wailed, a sound that seemed to be hunting for them. He hadn't eaten since lunch, saving the last of their cash for a proper dinner for Maya. His stomach twisted with a hollow, gnawing hunger, a dull ache that echoed the emptiness in his soul. The loneliness of being a single parent pressed down on him, a physical presence in the room, heavy and suffocating. He looked down at his hands, once so strong and capable, now trembling slightly. They were useless. With a shaky breath, Liam pulled out his battered smartphone, the screen a spiderweb of cracks. It was his last resort, a desperate portal to a world that no longer had a place for him. His thumb scrolled numbly past apartment listings that might as well have been on the moon. $2,000 security deposit, first and last month's rent, credit check required. Each requirement was a door slamming shut in his face. The air in the tiny room felt thick, and a tremor of pure panic ran up his spine. He was a good man, He'd worked hard his entire life, paid his taxes, tried to do right. How had it come to this? Trapped, cornered, counting down the last few dollars in a decaying motel room while his daughter's health failed. It was the absolute bottom, a silent scream of despair trapped in his chest. Hope wasn't just a foreign word. It was a cruel joke. He was completely alone, with nowhere left to turn. As his desperation peaked, a single, strange ad would catch his eye, changing everything. To discover the bizarre offer that could be their only salvation, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. His thumb, trembling, paused its desperate scrolling. Buried deep within a list of foreclosure notices and land auctions was an entry so strange it seemed like a mirage. The text was stark, minimal. Subterranean residential unit. The words themselves felt cold and alien. Below them, the part that made Liam's heart stop. One-time cash payment of $750. It was a price that felt both like a trap and a miracle. $750. It was almost exactly what he had left. A sliver of irrational, desperate hope pierced through the fog of his despair. He imagined a small, hidden basement apartment, perhaps forgotten by a landlord, a place protected from the wind and the cold. It was a gamble, a shot in the absolute dark. But the image of Maya sleeping on a park bench forced his hand. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. It was their only chance. He had to take it. He felt his throat tighten as he clicked the link, the weight of the world resting on this single, reckless decision. The decision was a silent war waged in the space of a minute. Liam's rational mind screamed that it was a scam, a cruel trick preying on the desperate. But then he looked over at Maya. Her small form curled under the thin motel blanket, and heard the faint telltale whistle in her breath. That sound was the only argument that mattered. The alternative, a crowded, disease-ridden shelter, or the raw exposure of the streets, was a horror he refused to accept. A roof, he whispered to himself, the words a prayer. It's a roof over her head. He pictured a key in his hand, a door that locked, a space that was theirs. With a shaking hand, he initiated the online transfer. The screen blinked, confirming the transaction. $800 became $50. A gut-wrenching feeling of finality washed over him. He felt the irreversible click of a door locking behind him. There was no going back. He had just bet their entire future on a ghost, a promise whispered from the digital ether. He felt sick with a mixture of terror and a fragile, newly born hope. He woke Maya with a gentleness that belied the storm raging inside him. "Hey, sleepyhead," he murmured, forcing a brightness into his voice that felt like a betrayal. "I've got a surprise. I found us a new place, our own little spot." Maya's eyes, still clouded with sleep, widened with a cautious optimism that broke his heart. He packed their single duffel bag, the movements automatic, his mind a whirlwind of what-ifs. The last of his cash, save for a few dollars for food, went into the gas tank of a one-way bus ticket. As the city's gleaming towers receded, replaced by a grey sprawl of neglected suburbs and then decaying industrial parks, Liam felt a growing unease. He held Maya's hand tightly, the smallness of it a stark contrast to the immense, unknown future they were driving toward. The bus groaned and rattled, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the anxiety pounding in his chest. Each mile that passed felt like another step away from civilization, another foot deeper into a terrible mistake. The journey was a descent into a landscape of forgotten things. The bus windows were grimy, streaked with dirt, framing a world of rust-colored factories and skeletal trees clawing at a washed-out sky. The air inside the bus was stale and heavy, with the scent of wet wool and cheap disinfectant. Maya, nestled against his side, had a quiet coughing fit, a low, persistent sound that made Liam's muscles tense with worry. He checked her inhaler for the 100th time, the cold plastic a small, inadequate comfort in his palm. He tried to distract her, pointing out a flock of pigeons on a wire, a splash of colorful graffiti on a brick wall, anything to keep the fear from her eyes. But his own dread was a physical thing, a cold stone in his stomach. He stared out at the passing desolation, a silent question screaming in his mind. What kind of home could possibly exist out here? The hope that had felt so real in the dim motel room was now fading with the daylight, leaving a chilling premonition in its wake. The bus hissed to a stop at a desolate corner, the door opening onto a street that felt less like a part of a city and more like its tombstone. A cold, biting wind whipped around them, carrying with it the smell of decay and wet concrete. Liam checked the address on his phone again, his heart sinking as he looked up. It was unmistakable. A colossal, abandoned factory loomed before them, a brick and steel carcass against the grey sky. Most windows were shattered black voids. The rest were sealed with rotting plywood. The entire property was encircled by a sagging chain-link fence crowned with coils of rusted barbed wire. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt malevolent, a place where things went to die. Liam felt a wave of nausea. This couldn't be it. Maya tugged on his sleeve, her voice a small, fearful whisper carried on the wind. "Daddy, is this our new house?" He didn't know how to answer, his throat suddenly tight and dry. He felt a profound sense of being cheated, of being led into a trap. Following the cryptic instructions from the anonymous email, Liam led Maya around the perimeter of the decaying behemoth. Their feet crunched on broken glass and debris. The stench of mildew and stagnant water grew stronger with every step. Tucked away at the rear of the building, half concealed by thorny weeds and a pile of discarded industrial refuse, they found it, a heavy, rust-streaked steel door set low into the foundation, looking more like the entrance to a vault than a home. Next to it, a small, grimy keypad was mounted on the concrete. His hands felt numb with cold and dread as he typed in the 6-digit code. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a loud, abrasive buzz split the air, and an internal lock disengaged with a heavy metallic clang that echoed like a gunshot. The sound seemed to travel right through him, a jolt of pure dread. He placed his hand on the cold steel of the door, and a powerful instinctual urge to run, to grab Maya and flee, seized him completely. He took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and pushed. The steel door was incredibly heavy, groaning in protest as he put his shoulder into it. It scraped open over the gritty concrete, revealing not a room, but a maw of absolute darkness. A wave of air rushed out, striking them with its foulness. It was a smell unlike any he'd ever encountered, a thick subterranean stench of pervasive mold, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. It was the smell of a sealed tomb being opened for the first time in decades. Liam's entire body recoiled. This was wrong, terribly wrong. He looked down at Maya, who had buried her face in his coat, and then back at the suffocating blackness. But the bus was gone. Their $50 wouldn't even get them back to the city. With a heart made of lead, feeling as though he were leading his own child to her doom, he gripped her hand and guided her down the steep, crumbling concrete steps into the waiting gloom below. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, the boom echoing in the vast space and sealing them in. The darkness was total, a physical pressure against their eyes. It was accompanied by a thick, oppressive silence, punctuated only by a single, maddening sound, the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water hitting a puddle somewhere in the blackness. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a surge of panic, a primal fear of being buried alive. His hands, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled along the damp and gritty texture of the wall. His fingers brushed against a small plastic nub, a switch. He flicked it. After a moment's hesitation, a single, naked bulb, hanging from a long, frayed wire, sputtered to life. It cast a weak, sickly yellow glow, its erratic flickering making the shadows writhe and dance. The light revealed the full, horrifying truth. This wasn't a residential unit. This was a vast, empty concrete cellar, a tomb. The last of his hope died in that instant, replaced by a cold, crushing despair that stole his breath. His eyes darted around the cavernous space, cataloguing the details of his monumental failure. The concrete walls wept with moisture, covered in sprawling black maps of mold. In several places, the concrete had surrendered, crumbling into soft piles of grey dust and grit on the floor. The air was a thick, chilling soup, so heavy with humidity that each breath felt like inhaling water from a swamp. The floor was a treacherous landscape of cracks and fissures, with wide, shallow puddles of dark, motionless water reflecting the miserable light from the single bulb. The incessant buzzing of the dying light fixture was a soundtrack to his despair, a constant threat of being plunged back into absolute blackness. There were no rooms, no bathroom, no kitchen, nothing. He had spent his last dollar to trap himself and his daughter in an underground ruin. The feeling was not just disappointment, it was a profound, suffocating sense of being completely and utterly undone. The immediate effect on Maya was exactly what he had feared most. The cold, wet air was a direct assault on her fragile lungs. A small, dry cough was the first sign. It was quickly followed by a deeper, more ragged one that racked her small frame. Liam watched in abject horror as her breathing grew strained, a high-pitched whistling sound that echoed terrifyingly in the cavernous space. Her face, already pale, took on a grey tinge in the ghastly yellow light. Her eyes, wide with a familiar panic, locked onto his. He felt a surge of adrenaline and self-loathing as he fumbled in his pocket for her emergency inhaler. His hands were shaking so violently that he almost dropped it. He managed to administer the puff of medicine, and her wheezing subsided slightly, but he knew it was a temporary reprieve. This place, their supposed sanctuary, was a toxic box that was actively poisoning his child. Every echoing cough was an accusation, a judgment on his failure as a father. He stumbled over to a wall, the rough, damp concrete pressing into his back as he slid down to the floor. The full, crushing weight of his mistake settled upon him. He had traded their last chance for this subterranean hell. He had envisioned something small, maybe grim, but fundamentally safe, dry, a place to regroup. Instead, he had led them into a death trap. The faceless entity who had posted the ad and taken his money felt like a phantom, a cruel joke played by the universe. He felt a searing rage, but it was quickly extinguished by a tidal wave of shame. He had been so desperate, so willing to believe in a miracle, that he had ignored every red flag. He, Liam, the man who built things, who protected his family, had brought his daughter to a place that could kill her. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to block out the sight of the crumbling walls. But the image was burned into his mind. He was a fool. He forced himself to his feet, a desperate need to find some redeeming feature, any small thing that could make this survivable, propelling him forward. He began to pace the perimeter of the massive chamber, his footsteps echoing like a funeral drum. He ran his hand along the weeping walls, his fingers coming away slick with cold slime. There were no other exits, no windows, no ventilation shafts, just the single steel door he couldn't possibly open from the inside without a key. The drip, drip, drip was a constant, maddening metronome counting down their time. The smell of rot was more pronounced in one corner. And in the dim light, he saw them, the disturbed nests of rats, small piles of shredded debris and filth. A shiver of pure revulsion crawled up his spine. This wasn't just a shelter, it was an active biohazard. The air was poison, the water was stagnant, and they were not alone. The cold dread in his stomach solidified into a lump of pure terror. Liam returned to Maya, who was huddled on the floor, wrapped in his thin jacket. He pulled her onto his lap, enveloping her in his arms, a futile attempt to share his body heat and shield her from the toxic air. He could feel the fine tremor of her shivering run through her body and into his. He looked around at the grim, flickering stage of his defeat. The dancing shadows made the vast room feel alive, malevolent. The city, with its noise and lights and people, felt like it was on another planet. They were utterly, completely alone, buried beneath the world. No one knew they were here. If the power failed, they would be entombed in a blackness so total it would feel solid. If Maya's breathing worsened, there would be no phone to call for help, no one to hear their screams. It was in this moment that he truly understood what rock bottom was. It wasn't the motel. It was this cold, wet, silent tomb. Tears of shame and fear finally spilled over, falling silently into her hair. A profound and terrifying loneliness settled over him, heavier than the concrete ceiling. He was a ghost in a forgotten place, a father who had led his only child into a grave. He felt a deep, bone-aching cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. It was the chill of absolute hopelessness, the feeling of every door in the universe slamming shut at once. He had gambled on a lie because the truth was too unbearable, and now he was paying the price. His body ached from the cold, his stomach churned with hunger, and his spirit felt broken, shattered into a million pieces. The silence in the room was immense, broken only by the steady drip of water and the shallow, rattling breaths of his daughter. He was a captain who had steered his ship directly onto the rocks, and now they were sinking into the dark, cold depths with no hope of rescue. He was a failure. The word pulsed in his mind with the rhythm of the dripping water. He began to hum a lullaby, an old tune his own mother used to sing to him. The sound was small and weak, immediately swallowed by the oppressive emptiness of the cellar. He rocked Maya gently, his gaze lost in the shifting shadows. His mind felt blank, wiped clean by the sheer magnitude of his despair. There was nothing left to do, nowhere left to go. This was the end of the line. The air was growing colder, and a distinct draught now snaked its way across the floor, chilling them to the bone. It seemed to be coming from a crack near the base of the wall. It was a minor annoyance in a sea of major catastrophes, but it was something he could do. As he shifted, preparing to stuff his jacket into the crack to block the draft, Maya stirred. She lifted a small, weak hand and pointed. "Daddy," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Look." Following her finger, his eyes landed on a single brick, slightly different from the others. It was there, in the deepest pit of his failure, that their story was about to truly begin. The cold draft was a physical torment, a relentless stream of icy air that snaked across the concrete floor and seemed to aim directly for Maya. In the depths of his despair, Liam felt a flicker of protective instinct. He had to block it. He scanned the grim cellar for anything, a piece of wood, old rags, anything to stop the chill. His eyes fell on a pile of debris in the corner. He was about to rise, his aching leg protesting the very thought, when Maya's voice, barely a whisper, sliced through the oppressive silence. "Daddy." He turned his head slowly, his movements sluggish with exhaustion. She was pointing a small, pale finger toward the base of the wall. "Look," she breathed, her voice raspy. A part of him wanted to tell her to rest, to save her energy, but there was a strange urgency in her tone, a flicker of focus in her eyes that he hadn't seen since they'd arrived in this concrete tomb. He followed her trembling finger with his gaze, his eyes struggling to adjust in the dim, flickering light. He saw nothing but crumbling, mold-stained concrete. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice hollow. He wanted to humor her, to give her this small moment of distraction from their horrifying reality. He saw only the same weeping wall, the same dark stains of mildew, the same gritty texture of decay. "The brick," she insisted, her voice a little stronger. "It's different." Liam squinted, leaning forward. His entire body felt heavy, as if weighted down with lead. The draft was indeed coming from that precise spot, a thin, almost invisible crack around a single block of concrete. The rest of the wall was constructed of large, poured sections, but here, for some reason, was a patch of individual bricks. It was an oddity, a flaw in the construction he hadn't noticed before. He saw how the mortar around this one particular brick seemed more decayed, more crumbly than the rest. It was as if it had been disturbed long ago. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of irritation, thinking it was just another sign of the building's utter neglect, another broken piece of their broken sanctuary. He crawled closer, ignoring the sharp protest from his injured leg and the damp cold that immediately soaked through the knees of his jeans. He had to see what she saw, to connect with her in this shared nightmare. As he neared the wall, he could feel the draft more strongly, a miniature river of frigid air flowing from the hairline fractures around the brick. He reached out a hand, his calloused fingers tracing the edges of the block. It felt different. The surface was smoother than the rough concrete surrounding it, worn down by time and moisture. Maya was right. It was loose. He could feel it shift, just a millimeter, under the pressure of his thumb. His heart, which had been beating with a slow, funereal rhythm, gave a sudden, sharp thud. A flicker of something other than pure despair ignited within him. It was a faint, almost forgotten feeling. Curiosity. In this place where all hope had died, a question mark had just appeared. It was a tiny light in an ocean of darkness. "You're right, Maya," he whispered, his voice thick with a strange new emotion. He ran his fingers over the surface of the brick again, this time with more intention. His fingertips, still sensitive from his years as a carpenter, were searching for details, and then he felt it, a series of shallow, faint grooves near the center. It wasn't random texturing from the mold, it was deliberate, A pattern. He angled his cracked phone, using its weak flashlight to get a better look. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the faint lines. He had to wipe away a thin layer of grime and slime, his stomach churning slightly at the feel of it. As the symbol became clearer, a cold shiver, completely unrelated to the draft, traveled up his spine. It was a star. A six-pointed star. Its lines almost completely eroded by time. A Star of David. What on earth was a hand-carved Star of David doing on a loose brick in the basement of an abandoned factory? The symbol felt ancient, a secret message left behind. The discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, clearing his mind for the first time in days. The oppressive weight of his failure lifted, just for a moment, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. This wasn't random. This was intentional. Someone had marked this brick for a reason. Someone had hidden something. The thought was absurd, the stuff of movies, but here in this desperate place, it felt undeniably real. He had to get it open. He needed a tool. His eyes, now sharp and alert, scanned the debris-strewn floor of the cellar. His gaze swept over piles of dust, broken bottles, and shredded bits of unidentifiable filth. He was no longer just a failed father in a cold basement. He was a carpenter again, looking for the right tool for the job. The instinct was so deeply ingrained, it felt like breathing. He needed leverage. He needed something strong and thin that he could use as a pry bar. The hunt gave him a sense of purpose, a mission that pushed back the suffocating despair. His eyes landed on a piece of metal sticking out from a pile of rubble near the far wall. He scrambled over, his movements now quick and urgent. He pulled at it, and with a shower of plaster and dirt, a 3-foot length of rusted rebar came free. It was heavy in his hand, the cold, rough texture of the oxidized metal, a familiar and comforting feeling. It was a crude instrument, but it was an instrument nonetheless. He felt a surge of his old self, the man who could fix things, who could build things. He gripped the rebar tightly, the cold steel a conduit for his newfound resolve. As he turned back toward the wall, he glanced at Maya. She was watching him, her eyes wide, the wheezing in her chest momentarily forgotten. She was caught up in the mystery, too. For the first time since they'd descended into this hole, they were a team, united not just by fear, but by a shared purpose. This small, fragile hope was more precious than anything. He wouldn't let her down this time. "Stay back a little." "Sweetie," he said, his voice low and steady. He knelt before the wall again, the rebar feeling like an extension of his own arm. He carefully positioned the sharpened, broken end of the metal rod into the most prominent crack in the mortar, right above the brick. He took a deep breath, the foul, damp air filling his lungs. Then he pushed. The sound was deafening in the silence of the cellar, a loud, grating scrape of metal against concrete. A shower of grey dust and crumbling mortar rained down onto the floor. It was the sound of a secret being disturbed, of a long-dormant seal being broken. He felt the brick resist, held fast by decades of inertia and damp. He repositioned the rebar, found a better angle, and pushed again, putting his shoulder and all of his weight into the effort. The muscles in his back, long unused to this kind of strain, screamed in protest. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched tight. This brick was not going to defeat him. He worked with a methodical patience, chipping away at the ancient mortar piece by piece. The scraping sounds echoed around them, a rhythmic, desperate work song. Scrape, chip, scrape. Each small victory, each piece of mortar that fell away, fueled his determination. He could feel the brick beginning to yield, its resistance weakening. The crack widened. He could now fit the tip of his fingers behind the top edge. It was cold and gritty to the touch. He felt a powerful, almost electric thrill. He was on the verge of something. He didn't know what, but the not knowing was 1,000 times better than the certainty of his earlier despair. He wedged the rebar one last time and gave a hard, sharp heave. There was a low thunk, and the brick shifted inward, dislodged from its ancient resting place. A wave of triumph, fierce and hot, washed over him. He had done it. He had opened the way. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. He dropped the rebar, the clang of it hitting the concrete making Maya jump. He worked his fingers into the gap he had created, the rough edges of the surrounding concrete scraping his skin. He wiggled the brick back and forth, slowly, painstakingly, breaking the remaining seals of old mortar. The grinding sound was like teeth being pulled. Finally, it came free. The brick was surprisingly heavy in his hands, dense and cold as a block of ice. He carefully set it down on the floor beside him, as if it were a sacred object. Where the brick had been, there was now a hole, a perfect, square cavity of absolute, impenetrable blackness. It was a void in the foundation of the building, a secret space deliberately created. A puff of air, impossibly ancient and stale, washed over his face. It carried a strange, dry smell, the scent of dust, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of oxidized metal. It was the smell of a forgotten story, of something hidden away from the world for a very, very long time. Liam's heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. His mind, which just an hour ago had been a barren wasteland of hopelessness, was now a frantic whirlwind of possibilities. What could possibly be hidden inside a wall? Money, a weapon, bones. A primal fear mixed with his intense curiosity, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He grabbed his phone again, his hand shaking slightly, and switched on the flashlight. He aimed the thin, pale beam into the dark cavity. The light wavered, illuminating a small enclosed space no bigger than a shoebox. And inside, sitting perfectly in the center, was an object. It was dark, squarish, and covered in a thick, lumpy layer of orange-brown rust. A box. A small metal box. A fresh wave of adrenaline shot through him, so potent it made him feel lightheaded. His breath hitched in his throat. This was it. This was what the brick had been guarding. The silence in the cellar seemed to deepen, as if the entire world were holding its breath. He hesitated for a long second, his gaze locked on the dark shape in the wall. A dozen horror stories he'd heard as a child flashed through his mind. Booby traps, curses, things left buried for a reason. He looked over at Maya, who had crawled closer, her small face a mixture of fear and awe. He saw his own desperate hope reflected in her wide eyes. For her, he had to know. For her, he had to be brave. Taking a ragged breath to steady his nerves, he reached his hand into the cold, dark void. The air inside the cavity was stagnant and icy. His fingers brushed against something hard, cold, and rough. The texture of the rusted metal was like coarse sandpaper, and a fine, gritty dust came away on his skin. It felt real, solid. He wrapped his fingers around it, his knuckles scraping against the top of the opening. It was heavier than he expected, dense and solid. With his heart hammering in his ears, he carefully began to draw the box out of its hiding place. He pulled it into the dim light of the cellar and set it gently on the concrete floor. It was a small, tin lockbox, the kind his grandfather used to keep stamps in, but this one was brutalized by time. The rust was not just a surface coating, it was a thick, cancerous growth that had warped the metal and sealed the lid shut as if it had been welded. The hinges had all but disintegrated, and the simple lock on the front was a frozen, unrecognizable lump of corrosion. It was a silent, stubborn sentinel, guarding its contents fiercely. He picked it up carefully, holding it in both hands. It was heavy, and when he gave it a gentle shake, he heard a distinct sound from within. It wasn't a rattle. It was a soft, muffled, and unmistakably heavy clinking. It was a sound that made his stomach clench with a wild, impossible thought. It was the sound of metal on metal, the sound of coins. He stared at the box, his mind refusing to make the leap, afraid of the crushing disappointment if he was wrong. Maya, seeing the box, let out a small gasp. Her fear had been completely eclipsed by a child's pure, unadulterated curiosity. She crawled right up beside him, her small hands hovering over the rusted metal as if she could feel a strange energy coming from it. "What is it, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Is it treasure?" The word hung in the air between them, fantastical and absurd in their grim surroundings. Treasure. It was the kind of thing you read about in books, not something you found in a rotting basement after losing everything. But as he looked at the impossibly old box in his hands and heard that heavy, muffled clinking, the word didn't sound so absurd anymore. A frantic, manic energy seized him. He had to open it. He had to know. He grabbed the rebar again, his movements no longer careful but filled with a desperate, feverish haste. He had to see what was inside. He had to know if this was a punchline to a cruel joke, or the answer to a prayer he hadn't even dared to voice. He wedged the pointed tip of the rebar into the seam where the lid met the body of the box. He used it like a chisel, tapping the other end with a loose piece of concrete he found nearby. Flakes of orange rust flew off, peppering his hands and the floor. Each tap was a sharp crack in the silence. He worked his way around the lid, chipping and prying, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The metal was stubborn, refusing to yield. He felt a surge of frustration, a fear that he would get this far only to be defeated by a rusted hinge. He repositioned the rebar, jamming it under the lip of the lid with all his strength, and then he leaned back, using it as a lever. There was a loud, groaning shriek of tortured metal, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of time. The lid bent upwards. It was opening. He threw the rebar aside and used his bare fingers, pulling at the warped metal until, with a final, sickening crunch, the lid tore free. For a moment, he just stared, unable to process what he was seeing. His brain couldn't reconcile the sight with the reality of his situation. The inside of the box seemed to glow. Under the miserable, flickering light of the single bare bulb, a soft, warm, yellow light emanated from within, a light that had not been seen by human eyes in generations. The box was filled, almost to the brim, with gold coins. They weren't shiny and new. They were dull with age, some bearing a faint patina of grime, but they were unmistakably, impossibly gold. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, nestled tightly together. The sheer weight of them, the solid reality of them, was staggering. Liam felt his breath leave his body in a long, shaky whoosh. The air seemed to buzz around him. He slowly reached out a trembling finger and touched the surface of one of the coins. It was cool, smooth, and incredibly, wonderfully real. Tears sprang to his eyes, not of sorrow, but of sheer, overwhelming disbelief. He scooped up a handful of the coins. They were heavy, their weight in his palm a shocking, grounding sensation. He let them spill through his fingers, the soft, metallic clinking sound, a cascade of impossible hope. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Maya let out a little squeal of delight, her small hands plunging into the pile of gold, her face illuminated by its soft glow. In that moment, the mold, the damp, the cold, all of it vanished. There was only the warm light of the gold and his daughter's joyous face. It was a miracle, a literal, buried-in-a-wall miracle. He laughed, a raw, incredulous sound that was half sob. It was enough. Enough to get them out of here. Enough for a new start. Enough for doctors, for Maya. It was everything. As his eyes adjusted to the treasure, he noticed something else, something dark, tucked beneath the final layer of coins at the very bottom of the box. It was a small object, wrapped carefully in what looked like a piece of dark, oiled cloth. His heart still hammering, he carefully pushed the remaining coins aside. The gold clinked softly, a gentle, musical sound. His fingers closed around the object. The oilcloth was smooth and slightly stiff, cool to the touch. It had done its job perfectly, protecting whatever was inside from the decades of damp and decay. He felt a new wave of anticipation, this time tinged with a solemnity. The coins were a fortune, but this felt different. This felt like the core of the secret. This felt like the story. He carefully unfolded the corners of the stiff, black cloth. Inside, nestled in the final layer of protection, was a small, thin book. It was a journal, bound in dark leather that was cracked and faded with extreme age. A thin leather strap, now brittle, was wrapped around it, holding it closed. It was a personal object, intimate and private. He could feel the history radiating from it, a silent testament to a life he couldn't imagine. The gold was the what. He had a chilling feeling that this journal was the why. He held the journal in his palm. It felt impossibly fragile, a relic from another time. Who had owned this? Who had taken the time to hide their life savings? And then, most importantly, this small leather-bound book. Who was Isaac, and what was his plea for justice? The gold coins were a lifeline, a ticket out of their current hell. But this journal, this felt like a responsibility. Their sacred trust passed on through a wall of brick and a barrier of time. The Star of David on the brick, The pre-war coins, the hidden journal, they were all pieces of a puzzle, a story of desperation that echoed his own, yet was clearly so much more. He looked from the glittering gold to the silent, waiting journal. He had found a treasure, but he had a powerful, unnerving feeling that he had also just stumbled into the middle of a ghost story, a story that was far from over. The real mystery, he realized, had only just begun. The cellar was no longer just a tomb, it was now a crime scene, and he was its only witness. He ran his thumb over the cracked leather cover of the journal. The texture was dry, almost powdery, and it sent a faint, dusty smell of old paper and leather into the air. There was no name, no title, nothing on the outside to give any clue as to its contents. It was completely anonymous. The thin strap that held it shut was so brittle he was afraid it would turn to dust if he touched it. He handled it with the reverence one would give to a holy text. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that opening this book would change everything. The gold could be explained away as a lucky find, a forgotten stash, but a journal, filled with words and emotions, was different. A journal was a testimony. A journal demanded to be heard. As he sat there on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by a fortune in gold, he felt a profound shift inside him. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was now the keeper of a secret, the inheritor of a story that had been waiting in the dark for him, and only him to arrive. He looked at Maya, who was now quietly stacking coins into small, glittering towers. Her face, illuminated by the golden light, was serene. For this one moment, she was not a sick child in a dangerous place. She was just a little girl who had found pirate treasure. The sight strengthened his resolve. The person who wrote this journal had gone to incredible lengths to make sure it survived. They had bricked it up in a wall with their life savings, hoping that one day someone like him, someone desperate enough to end up in a place like this, would find it. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into an ocean of time. He owed it to them to read it. He owed it to this nameless, faceless person to understand their story. He felt a strange kinship with the author, a bond forged across decades of silence and despair. Whatever was written in those pages, he would face it. The gold could save their future, but he had a feeling this journal held the key to someone's past, a past that was now inextricably tangled with his own. A strange sense of calm settled over him, pushing aside the frenetic energy of the discovery. The cellar was still cold, still damp, but it no longer felt merely oppressive. Now, it felt historic. It felt important. He understood that his journey into this dark place was not an end, but a bizarre and terrifying beginning. The gold coins were a physical manifestation of a hidden history, but the journal was its soul. The spidery script he would soon discover within its pages contained a terrible secret, a chronicle of betrayal and a plea for a justice that had been denied for nearly a century. He had stumbled out of his own story of despair and fallen headfirst into someone else's. The flickering bulb overhead seemed to cast long, dancing shadows that looked like figures from the past, whispering encouragement. He knew what he had to do. He had to read the journal. He had to uncover the truth buried in this cold, forgotten place, no matter how dark it turned out to be. The mystery of the cellar was just beginning to unfold. He gently unwound the brittle leather strap from the journal. It crumbled slightly under his fingers, turning to dark dust. He felt a pang of sadness, as if he had broken a final, fragile link to the past. He opened the cover. The first page was filled with elegant yet spidery handwriting. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. The script was dense, covering every inch of the page. It was written in English, but with a formal sound, slightly European cadence. He couldn't make out the words in the dim and flickering light. He needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere he could concentrate, to give this story the attention it deserved. He carefully rewrapped the journal in its oilcloth sheath, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed now fully awake. He placed it carefully inside his jacket pocket, where it rested against his chest, a small, solid weight. It felt like he was carrying a heart, a story that had stopped beating long ago, now waiting for him to give it life again. This was far more than just money. He turned his attention back to the lockbox. The gold coins seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the gloom. This was their ticket out. He had to be smart. He couldn't just walk out of here with a box of gold. He needed a plan. First, they had to survive the night. He looked around the cellar with new eyes. It was no longer just a prison. It was a temporary hiding place, a place that held a secret fortune and a deeper, darker truth. He gathered the coins, his hands moving quickly, and poured them into the now empty duffel bag he'd carried their meager belongings in. The bag, which had felt so depressingly light before, was now almost too heavy to lift. The weight was real. The hope was real. He felt a surge of power, a feeling of control that he had lost months ago. He was no longer helpless. He had resources, he had a secret, and he had a story to uncover. The game had changed. The cellar had given him a weapon, and he was ready to figure out how to use it. The despair was gone, replaced by a dangerous, thrilling sense of purpose. As he zipped the duffel bag, the sound loud and definitive in the quiet space, he glanced back at the empty cavity in the wall. It looked like a dark, vacant eye staring back at him, a silent witness. He took the heavy brick he had removed and carefully fitted it back into the opening. It slid into place with a soft, grinding sound. It wasn't a perfect fit, and anyone looking closely would see that it had been disturbed, but in the gloom, it would pass a casual inspection. He used some of the damp mortar dust to smudge the cracks, further concealing his work. He was hiding the evidence of his discovery, an instinct he didn't question. He didn't know who or what he was hiding it from, but a deep, primal sense of caution had taken hold. This cellar had kept its secret for 80 years. It could keep his for a little while longer. The mystery was his now, a heavy and precious burden that he would carry out of this darkness and into the light. He only hoped he would be ready for what that light revealed. He sat back on his heels, his work done. The wall looked almost as it had before, a seamless facade of decay. But he knew what was different. He knew the truth it had concealed. He looked at Maya, who was now dozing, her head resting on a pile of their clothes, a single gold coin still clutched in her small hand. A fierce, protective love surged through him, so intense it was painful. He had found the means to save her. He had stumbled upon a forgotten fortune that would guarantee her health, her safety, her future. But as he felt the solid outline of the journal against his chest, he knew this was about more than just them. A terrible injustice had been committed in this very spot. A life, or perhaps more than one, had been stolen, and a story had been buried alive. He had been chosen by sheer random, desperate chance to be its excavator. The gold was the key, but the journal was the door, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his very core, that on the other side of that door, a monster was waiting. After settling Maya into a makeshift bed of their coats in the least damp corner, Liam finally allowed himself to sit. The adrenaline from finding the gold had subsided, leaving a trembling exhaustion in its wake. But sleep was impossible. The small, leather-bound journal in his jacket pocket felt like a burning coal against his chest. With the heavy duffel bag of gold coins resting near his feet, a tangible promise of escape. He knew he couldn't rest until he understood the story that came with it. He pulled out the book. In the weak, flickering light of the bare bulb, he opened it to the first page. The ink was faded, a ghostly brown against the yellowed paper, but the handwriting was clear, precise, and filled with a desperate elegance. October 12th, 1938. My name is Isaac Feldman. I was a watchmaker in Berlin. Now, I am a ghost in a foreign land, waiting for the two halves of my heart, my Leah and my sweet Daniel, to cross the sea. Mr. Arthur Vance, the owner of this great factory, has promised me sanctuary. Liam's breath caught in his throat. He carefully turned the fragile page, the dry paper whispering under his touch. The next entry was filled with a cautious, fragile hope that felt achingly familiar to Liam. October 25th, 1938. Mr. Vance is a man of great standing. He speaks of progress, of building a new world. He showed me this basement space and a temporary home, he said, until my family arrives. The air is damp, but the silence is a comfort after the shouting and broken glass of Berlin. He assures me the arrangements are proceeding. I have given him everything. Our family savings, the gold my father gave me, every last piece. It is a small price to pay for the lives of my wife and son. He says their passage is booked on the S.S. St. Louis, sailing for Cuba in the spring. Hope is a dangerous thing for a man like me to possess, but when I close my eyes, I can almost feel Daniel's small hand in mine. I can almost hear Leah's laughter. Soon, we will be a family again, safe from the spreading darkness. The sincerity in the words made Liam's stomach clench tight. Liam's own desperate gamble, the $750 he'd spent on this tomb, felt like a child's game in comparison. He read on, his fingers tracing the spidery script as if to absorb the story through his skin. The entries over the next few months chronicled a growing anxiety, a mounting dread that Liam felt as a cold knot in his own gut. January 14th, 1939. The winter is cold in this cellar. The dampness seeps into my bones. Mr. Vance no longer visits. His foreman brings me food, but his eyes are hard and empty. When I ask for news of the ship, of my family, he says only, "Mr. Vance is a busy man, all is in hand. I have started hiding some of the gold my father insisted I keep on my person. I have found a loose brick, a small precaution, a foolish one, perhaps. My unease is a physical thing, a constant pressure behind my eyes. I spend my days pacing this concrete box, my mind a storm of prayer and fear. I tell myself this is the price of safety. I tell myself that soon the waiting will be over. But the silence from Mr. Vance is a silence I am beginning to know too well. The next entry was dated months later, the handwriting noticeably different. It was frantic, jagged, the letters sharp with a terror that leaped off the page and sank its claws into Liam's heart. May 27th, 1939. Betrayal. The word is too small. The SS St. Louis arrived in Cuba. I know this from a scrap of newspaper the foreman used to wrap my bread. It lists the names of those seeking asylum. Leah's name is not on the manifest. Daniel's name is not on the manifest. My blood turned to ice in my veins. My heart has become a stone in my chest. He never booked their passage. He never intended to. It was all a lie, a monstrous, cruel lie. The money is gone. My family, oh God, my family, where are they? I screamed his name until my throat was raw, but only the damp walls screamed back. I am a fool, a blind, trusting fool who led his own lambs to the slaughter. He has taken everything. He has taken my life, my future, my very soul. There is nothing left but this cold, concrete box and the ghost of a hope that has now turned into my personal hell. He has murdered my heart. A wave of nausea washed over Liam. He felt an intimate connection to Isaac's pain, the horror of a parent realizing they have been ensnared in a trap that has doomed their child. He read the next few entries through a film of tears. They were short, fragmented, a descent into madness and despair. Isaac wrote of pounding on the steel door until his knuckles were raw and bloody, his cries for help swallowed by the tons of earth and concrete above him. He wrote of the gold coins hidden in the wall, no longer a hope for a new life, but a final, desperate prayer for justice, a breadcrumb trail for some future soul to find. He prayed that someone, someday would uncover the truth of what Arthur Vance had done. The gold was not for him anymore. It was for his avenger. Liam felt the weight of that word, avenger, settle on his shoulders. He was no longer just a finder of lost treasure. He was the inheritor of a sacred, blood-soaked duty. He was the one Isaac had been waiting for, all these silent, lonely decades. The final entry was almost illegible, the script a weak, spidery scrawl at the bottom of a page, as if written by a hand with no strength left. June 19th, 1939. They are walling me in. I hear them now, on the other side of the basement. The scrape of trowels, the soft thud of bricks being laid. They are not even bothering with the door. They are building a new wall, sealing this section of the cellar forever, sealing me in. This is to be my tomb. Vance is not just a thief. He is a monster. He is burying his crime. He is burying me. I do not know what he has done with my Leah and my Daniel, but I know now I will never see them again in this life. I pray he has not harmed them, but I feel a cold certainty in my dying heart that he has. This journal is my only witness. The gold is the proof of the theft. Find it. Find this. Avenge us. Do not let him build an empire on the bones of my family. Do not let him... The ink trailed off into a faint, wavering line, as if the pen had fallen from a dying hand. The silence that followed was deafening. Liam closed the journal, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. The cellar was no longer a grim, abandoned space. It was a grave. He was sitting in Isaac Feldman's grave. The cold air he felt was not just dampness, it was the chilling presence of a historical crime, a story of profound evil that had been physically sealed into the foundations of the building. The gold in his bag was not a windfall. It was evidence. It was a story of stolen hope, a family destroyed by greed and hatred. He looked over at Maya, sleeping peacefully, and felt a surge of protective fury that was almost primal. The man who did this, Arthur Vance, had built his fortune on the murder of a family, on the live entombment of a man whose only crime was to be desperate and to trust the wrong person. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure in his chest. The faint smell of rust and damp earth now seemed to him like the smell of old blood and forgotten tears. Suddenly, a sound from the world above shattered the tomb-like silence. A loud metallic bang, followed by another. It was a heavy, authoritative knocking, not on a wooden door but on the solid steel of the cellar entrance. Liam froze, his blood turning to ice. His every muscle went rigid. It was an impossible sound. No one knew they were here. No one. The anonymous cellar was a ghost. The bus had dropped them and disappeared. They were off the grid, buried. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. Bang, bang, bang. It echoed through the cavernous space, a terrifying, percussive summons from the outside world, a world he thought they had left behind. Maya stirred in her sleep, whimpering. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might break. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Who could possibly be at the door? And more importantly, what did they want? The sound of the heavy lock disengaging with a loud, electronic buzz was the sound of his sanctuary being breached. The heavy steel door groaned open, scraping against the concrete floor. It revealed not the grey, desolate evening, but the imposing silhouette of a man standing against the fading light. For a moment, Liam couldn't make out any details. But as the figure stepped forward and began to descend the crumbling steps, his features came into focus under the weak, flickering bulb. He was an old man, perhaps 70, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark wool overcoat and expensive leather shoes that seemed absurdly out of place in this ruin. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his face was lined, but handsome. He carried himself with an air of quiet, confident power. A polite, almost grandfatherly smile touched his lips as his eyes adjusted to the gloom and landed on Liam. "Apologies for the intrusion," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, completely devoid of surprise at finding someone in the cellar. "I was hoping I might have a word." His calm demeanor was the most terrifying thing Liam had ever witnessed. The man's eyes swept the room, taking in the crumbling walls, the makeshift bed, and finally, Maya, who was now sitting up, rubbing her eyes. His polite smile widened slightly. "My name is Marcus Vance," he said, extending a gloved hand that Liam did not take. "I'm with the city's Historical Preservation Society." Liam's heart stopped. Vance. The name from the journal. It couldn't be a coincidence. The blood drained from his face, and he felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the past were physically reaching out to grab him. This had to be Arthur Vance's kin. "The Society has been trying to acquire this entire industrial park for years," Vance continued, his voice a smooth, practiced monologue. "This building is a significant landmark, and we believe it deserves to be protected. I was notified by our system that this particular unit, this basement, was recently purchased. I must say, I was quite surprised." His gaze flickered to the duffel bag near Liam's feet. A brief, almost imperceptible glance, but Liam saw it. "We're very keen on consolidating the property," Vance said, his eyes now fixed on Liam, the smile never wavering. "It's a matter of historical integrity. I see you've made a home for yourself and your lovely daughter down here. It's rustic." There was a faint, condescending amusement in his tone that made Liam's skin crawl. "But surely not a suitable place for a child, especially one who seems to be coughing." Maya let out a small, weak cough, as if on cue, and Vance's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. "I am authorized by the Society's board," he went on, pulling a checkbook from his inner coat pocket, "to make you a generous offer to relinquish your deed. Think of it as a finder's fee, or a donation to help you and your daughter find a more hygienic living situation. Let's say $1,000. A tidy profit on your investment, and you can be on your way this very evening. The offer was an insult. A test. He was fishing. He was trying to see what Liam knew. Every instinct in Liam's body screamed at him to take the money and run. To grab Maya, leave the gold, leave the journal, and just disappear. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But then he felt the solid weight of the journal against his ribs, and he thought of Isaac Feldman's last, desperate words. Avenge us. He thought of the family destroyed, the life stolen. He looked at Marcus Vance, at his expensive coat and his false gun polite smile, and he saw the monstrous legacy of a murderer. The gold wasn't just a treasure, it was a weapon. The journal was the ammunition. He couldn't run. Not now. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Liam found his voice. "We're fine here," he said, the words feeling thin and brittle in the cold air. "Thank you for the offer, but it's not for sale." He held Vance's gaze, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The silence that followed was heavy and cold, thick with unspoken meaning. The shift was instantaneous and terrifying. The friendly, philanthropic mask did not just slip, it evaporated. The smile vanished from Marcus Vance's lips, and his eyes, which had been crinkling at the corners, became cold, hard, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a predator that has just had its prey refuse to lie down and die. He slowly, deliberately, put his checkbook back into his coat. "I see," he said, his voice losing all its cultured smoothness, becoming flat and menacing. A man of principle, or perhaps just a man who is sitting on something he believes to be of greater value. The words hung in the air, a direct and chilling accusation. Vance took a slow step forward, his gaze sweeping over the crumbling walls, the weeping cracks in the concrete. He ran a gloved finger along a fissure, collecting a smear of grime and moisture. The polite pretense was over. This was the real man. This was the grandson of Arthur Vance, the protector of the family's dark secret. "You know," Vance said conversationally, though his voice was laced with ice, "these old industrial buildings, they're not very stable." He looked up at the ceiling, at the network of cracks spreading from the spot where the single bulb was hanging. The foundations shift, concrete degrades, especially with all this damp. It's a miracle the whole thing hasn't collapsed already. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He then looked directly at Maya, who was huddled behind Liam, her eyes wide with fear. It would be a terrible tragedy if there were to be some kind of structural failure, a sudden collapse. These things happen. Accidents, especially when there are people living where they shouldn't be. He wasn't asking anymore. He was delivering a threat as cold and as hard as the concrete walls that surrounded them. He was telling Liam that he could bury him just as his grandfather had buried Isaac Feldman. Vance gave a final, chillingly calm look around the cellar, his eyes once again lingering on the duffel bag. "Think about my offer, Mr. Whoever you are. $1,000 is a lot of money for a man in your position. It's certainly more than your life is worth." He turned without another word and ascended the stairs, his expensive shoes crunching softly on the gritty steps. The heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound booming through the cellar, and the lock re-engaged with a final, definitive clang. Liam was left alone in the flickering gloom, his body trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. The threat echoed in the silence, a promise of violence hanging over their heads. He now understood. Marcus Vance didn't just know about the rumors. He knew about the journal, he knew about the gold, and he would kill to keep the secret buried. Liam was no longer just the keeper of a story. He was a target. What would you do in his place? Would you run, taking the gold and leaving the story buried forever? Or would you stay and fight for Isaac's justice, knowing you were putting your own child's life on the line? The echoing clang of the steel door was the sound of a tomb being sealed. Liam stood frozen in the flickering gloom, the menacing silence pressing in on him. Marcus Vance's threat wasn't a mere possibility. It was a promise, as cold and solid as the concrete floor beneath his feet. A structural collapse. Accidents happen. The words circled in his mind like vultures. He felt a tremor run through his body that had nothing to do with the cold. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at Maya, who was now fully awake, her small face a mask of confusion and fear. He had found a fortune only to be told it was his death warrant. Every escape route his mind tried to conjure led to a dead end. Vance knew. He had systems in place. He'd been notified of the sale. He was watching. They were trapped in this grave, and the killer's grandson was standing guard at the entrance, waiting for the right moment to kick the dirt in on top of them. Liam's heart hammered a frantic, desperate beat against his ribs, a drumbeat of pure panic. His mind raced, a chaotic storm of fear and fury. Run. Where? Vance would find them. The man headed a massive real estate corporation. He had eyes and ears everywhere. Liam was a ghost with a disabled leg, a sick child, and a bag of gold that was now more of a target than a salvation. Stay? That was suicide. Vance had made it clear he would not hesitate to bury them here, to turn this cellar into their final resting place, a footnote in a demolition report. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. He felt the phantom weight of Isaac's despair settling upon his own shoulders. He was living the same nightmare, a man trapped by a powerful, ruthless Vance, his child's life hanging in the balance. The journal in his pocket felt heavier than the gold, a sacred responsibility that was now chained to a death sentence. He had to think. He had to find a way out, not just of the cellar, but of the web Vance was weaving around them. He needed help. He needed someone who knew this place, someone who wasn't on Vance's payroll. His gaze darted around the desolate landscape outside the single grimy window, set high in the factory wall. Across a weed-choked lot stood a single building that showed signs of life, a dilapidated tenement, a grim brick box with a few windows glowing with a weak, yellow light. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at a straw in a hurricane, but it was the only other human presence for miles. He had to risk it. He had to find someone, anyone, who might know the history of this place, someone who was here before Vance's empire scrubbed the truth from the land. He felt a surge of desperate resolve. He would not let his daughter die in this hole. He turned to Maya, forcing a smile that felt like a brittle mask. "Hey," he whispered, his voice shaking. "We're going to play a new game. It's called Super Quiet Spies. We have to be completely silent." He zipped the journal securely into his inner pocket and hefted the duffel bag, its weight a terrifying and empowering burden. He had one chance. He approached the steel door, his heart in his throat. There was no keypad on this side, no way to open the lock. Panic flared again, hot and sharp, but then his carpenter's eye caught it, a manual override lever, tucked away near the hinge, covered in rust and cobwebs. It was designed for emergencies, a way for workers to get out during a power failure. Arthur Vance, in his monstrous arrogance, had overlooked it, or perhaps Isaac simply never found it. With a silent prayer, Liam put his shoulder into the lever. It resisted, frozen with decades of disuse. He grunted, straining, his muscles screaming. With a deep, groaning shriek of protesting metal, the lock disengaged. He carefully, slowly, pulled the heavy door open just enough to slip through, the scraping sound on the concrete deafening in the silence. He peered out into the deepening twilight. The world was empty. The wind whispered through the weeds, a lonely, mournful sound. Holding Maya's hand in a death grip, he slipped out of the tomb and into the cold. They moved like ghosts across the blighted landscape, hunched low, dashing from the cover of one skeletal, leafless bush to another. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps. Every distant glint of light seemed like the headlights of an approaching car. Liam's leg throbbed with a fiery pain, but he ignored it, fueled by adrenaline and a father's primal fear. The tenement building loomed larger, each lit window a potential beacon of hope or a point of observation for his enemies. He felt exposed, a target. He imagined Vance's men watching them through binoculars, a cold smile on their faces as the mice scurried from one trap to another. The air was frigid, and Maya's breath was beginning to form small, white clouds. He could hear the faint, telltale whistle starting in her chest again, and the sound spurred him onward. They finally reached the relative safety of the tenement's crumbling brick wall, pressing themselves into the shadows of the alley, the rough brick scraping against Liam's back. He found a side entrance, the door unlocked, and they slipped into a narrow hallway that smelled overwhelmingly of boiled cabbage, dust and decay. The air was thick and still. A single, fly-specked bulb cast a jaundiced glow on the peeling, water-stained wallpaper. He listened. From behind one door, a television blared. From another, a baby cried. These were the sounds of life, of a world that existed outside of Vance's orbit. He needed the oldest resident, the one with the longest memory. On the tarnished brass mailboxes in the vestibule, he scanned the names. Most were taped on temporary, but one was different. A small engraved plaque, so old the letters were almost smooth. A. Nowak, 3B. It was a name that had been there for a very, very long time. With a heart that felt like a stone in his chest, Liam led Maya up the creaking, groaning stairs, his hand hovering over the weight of the journal in his pocket. He was about to knock on a stranger's door and ask them to believe an impossible story. The door to 3B was old, the dark wood scarred with the marks of time. A faint light shone from beneath it. Liam could hear the slow, steady tick-tock of a grandfather clock from within. It was a sound of immense, unhurried stillness. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated. What was he going to say? "Excuse me, I found a dead man's journal and a box of gold in the basement next door, and now his murderer's grandson is trying to kill me and my daughter." It sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. He felt a wave of despair, the sheer insanity of his situation washing over him. But then Maya coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. That was all the motivation he needed. He took a deep breath, the stale air of the hallway filling his lungs, and knocked. The sound was loud in the silence. The ticking of the clock inside stopped. He held his breath, listening to the shuffle of slow footsteps approaching the door. The door opened a crack, held by a thick brass chain. A single, bright blue eye, surrounded by a constellation of deep wrinkles, peered out at him. It was the eye of a very old woman, sharp and alert, taking in his disheveled appearance, the terrified child clinging to his leg, and the heavy duffel bag in his hand. "Yes!" The voice was thin and reedy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, but it held a wiry strength. It was not a feeble voice, it was the voice of a survivor. I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," Liam stammered, his own voice sounding rough and desperate. "My name is Liam. This is my daughter, Maya. We're in trouble. I need to ask you about the factory next door, about its history." The woman's eye narrowed. A flicker of something, suspicion, fear, recognition, passed through it. "The factory is dead," she said, her voice flat. "It's been dead for 50 years. Go away." She started to close the door. In a panic, Liam blurted out the only name he could think of. "Isaac Feldman. I need to know about Isaac Feldman." The name hit her like a physical blow. The blue eye widened in shock. The hand on the door froze. For a long moment, there was no sound but the frantic pounding of Liam's heart and the ragged whisper of Maya's breathing. The woman stared at him, her gaze piercing, searching his face for something. He could see a lifetime of buried memories, of old fears and ancient sorrows, swirling in the depths of that one visible eye. Her knuckles, gnarled with arthritis, were white where she gripped the edge of the door. "Who are you?" she whispered, the reedy voice now trembling with a profound emotion he couldn't name. It was a mix of terror and awe. "How do you know that name?" Liam fumbled inside his coat, his fingers closing around the cool leather of the journal. "He left this," Liam said, holding the small book up so she could see it. "He left this for someone to find. I found it." A small, choked gasp escaped the woman's lips. With a trembling hand, she fumbled with the chain lock, her fingers clumsy with age and shock. The chain fell away with a soft clatter. The door swung open. He stepped into another era. The small apartment was meticulously clean, but crowded with the artifacts of a long life. The air smelled of lavender, mothballs, and old paper. A magnificent grandfather clock stood against one wall, its pendulum still. Every surface was covered with lace doilies, faded photographs in silver frames, and delicate porcelain figurines. The woman who stood before him was tiny, stooped with age, her back a fragile curve. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and her thin white hair was pinned in a neat bun. This was Agnes Nowak. She reached out a trembling, bird-like hand, her papery skin cool to the touch, and gestured toward the journal. "May I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Liam handed it to her. She held it in both hands, her thumb stroking the worn leather cover with a strange, heartbreaking tenderness, as if she were greeting a long-lost friend. Tears welled in her bright blue eyes, spilling over and tracing silvery paths through the wrinkles on her cheeks. "I never thought I never thought anyone would ever know, she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. She looked up at Liam, her gaze filled with a sorrow that seemed bottomless. I was a girl, 16 years old. I cleaned the offices in the factory. She gestured for Liam and Maya to sit on a faded floral sofa, its springs groaning in protest. Agnes sank into a worn armchair, the ancient journal held to her chest like a sacred relic. Mr. Vance. Arthur Vance. He was like a king. Everyone feared him. He was a cruel man, a man who hated people like Isaac. Her voice dropped, and she glanced at Maya, who was watching her with wide, curious eyes. Agnes gave her a small, sad smile before her gaze returned to the journal in her lap. Isaac was a good man, a kind man. He had gentle eyes. He fixed my mother's old watch and would not take a penny. He was just waiting for his family. That's all he ever talked about, his Leah and his little boy Daniel. Agnes's story tumbled out, a torrent of memory held back for more than 70 years. She told him how Arthur Vance had promised Isaac safe passage for his family in exchange for his savings, how he had hidden Isaac in the basement, telling him it was for his own protection. But I knew it was a lie, she whispered, her voice cracking. I saw the look in Vance's eyes. It was a spider's look. I started sneaking food to Isaac, down the old coal chute, bread, sometimes a piece of cheese. He was so grateful. He would ask me every day, any news of the ship, Agnes, any news of my Leah. Her voice broke, and she paused, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. I had to lie to him. I told him I heard nothing. I couldn't bear to tell him what I'd heard the foreman say, that Vance was bragging about the fortune he'd liberated from some fool. The ugliness of the betrayal, confessed after so many years, filled the small, quiet room with a palpable sickness. Liam felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Then one day, Agnes continued, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, I went to the chute, and it was blocked, bricked over from the inside. I panicked. I ran to the back of the factory, to the basement entrance, and I heard them. The sounds of brick and mortar. They were walling it up. They were walling him in. She was openly weeping now, quiet, shuddering sobs that shook her tiny frame. I confronted Mr. Vance. I was just a stupid, brave girl. I asked him where Isaac was. He grabbed my arm. His fingers were like steel. He told me that if I ever spoke Isaac Feldman's name again, he would make sure my entire family disappeared. He said he'd put my father and brothers in the foundation of his new wing and that no one would ever find them. The threat was so specific, so monstrous. It stole the air from Liam's lungs. This was the evil he was up against. It wasn't just greed. It was a capacity for absolute cruelty that had been passed down from grandfather to grandson. Liam felt his own fear being eclipsed by a cold, hardening rage. He finally understood the full scope of the evil he had unearthed. It wasn't just a financial crime. It was a story of unspeakable cruelty and murder. His family, Liam said, his voice hoarse. The journal says he didn't know what happened to his wife and son. He thought they were still in Germany. Agnes shook her head, a single, definitive, heart-breaking motion. No, she said, her voice filled with a chilling certainty. They never left the city. Arthur Vance was not a man who left loose ends. He promised to arrange their passage, and he did. He brought them here. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Liam's blood ran cold. He didn't want to ask the next question, but he had to. He had to know the full truth. Agnes, where are they? What did he do to them? The old woman closed her eyes, as if the memory was a physical pain. She took a long, shaky breath before she spoke the words that would complete the horrifying puzzle. He was building a new extension on the west side of the factory that year, she whispered, her eyes still closed. Pouring a new concrete foundation. It was a massive project. They dug deep. A week after Isaac was sealed away, the foreman, a cruel man named Jensen, got very drunk at a local tavern. My father overheard him. He was bragging, trying to impress some woman, talking about the special bonuses Mr. Vance gave for dirty work. Agnes opened her eyes, and they were filled with a terrible, ancient knowledge. Jensen said that the new foundation was stronger than any other in the city because it had reinforcement. He laughed. He said it had Jewish reinforcement. They were never on a ship, Liam. They never had a chance. Arthur Vance murdered them and buried Leah and her little boy. Daniel is under tons of concrete. They're still there. They've been under that factory this whole time. The room fell silent, the only sound the frantic ticking of the clock, which had somehow started again. The sheer, calculated monstrosity of the crime was breathtaking. It was a holocaust in miniature, a family wiped from the earth and used as building materials for an empire of greed. Liam felt sick to his stomach. He looked at the gold coins peeking from the top of his duffel bag. They were stained, not with dirt but with blood, the blood of Isaac, Leah, and little Daniel. The weight of his responsibility became almost unbearable. This was never about the money. This was about unearthing a grave. This was about giving names back to the dead. He looked at Agnes, this tiny woman who had carried this horrific secret for a lifetime, the poison of it slowly eating away at her from the inside. He saw in her not just an ally, but a fellow witness, the sole guardian of a story that refused to die. The past was no longer the past. It was a living, breathing entity in this small room, demanding justice, demanding to be heard. He knew now that there was no running, no hiding. He had to expose them. Just as the resolve solidified in his heart, a terrifyingly familiar sound cut through the night, the heavy, guttural roar of a diesel engine, followed by the screech of tires on pavement. Liam's blood ran cold. He rushed to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the faded curtains. Down below, in the weed-choked lot, a large, unmarked panel truck had pulled up directly in front of the factory. The doors were emblazoned with a generic logo, Municipal Structural Survey. It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. The passenger door opened, and two large, burly men in hard hats and tool belts got out. They moved with a purpose that had nothing to do with civil engineering. They were thugs. Vance hadn't wasted any time. He wasn't going to risk a structural collapse that might be investigated. He was sending his men in to retrieve the journal and the gold saké and to eliminate the witness. Liam felt a surge of pure adrenaline. They were coming back for him. He turned from the window, his face pale. "He's here," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Vance, he sent men." Agnes, who had stood up, her face a mask of renewed fear, shuffled to the window and looked down. A small, defeated sound escaped her lips. "They're pretending to be city inspectors," Liam explained, his mind racing. "They're going to tear the place apart looking for the journal. And for us." He looked at Maya, who had started to cry, sensing the terror that was arcing between the adults. He had to get her out. He had to protect the evidence. The journal was in his pocket, but the gold, the irrefutable proof of the theft that started it all, was in the heavy duffel bag. He couldn't leave it, but it would slow him down. He was trapped. The tenement felt like a prison now, not a sanctuary. The men below were unlocking the factory gate with a key. They knew the codes. They owned this place, this land of ghosts, and they were coming to reclaim its secrets. Suddenly, the plan came to him, a desperate yet wild gamble born of pure necessity. The men weren't just there to kill him. They were there for the treasure. They were greedy men, sent by a greedy man. He could use that. He looked at Agnes, his eyes wild with a terrifying idea. "Agnes, can you call the police? Tell them there are armed men breaking into the factory. Tell them you hear screaming. Anything to get them here, but it might be too late." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Maya, kneeling down to look her in the eyes. "Maya, sweetie, I need you to be the bravest girl in the world for me right now. We have to go back to the dark place for just a minute, but I promise, I will get you out." He hefted the heavy duffel bag. "I have an idea." He didn't know if it was a brilliant plan or a suicidal one, but it was the only one he had. He had to split their attention. He had to give them a choice between the treasure and the witness. Before Agnes could even reach her ancient rotary phone, the sounds began. A loud metallic crash from the factory next door, followed by the unmistakable, brutal sound of a sledgehammer hitting a concrete wall. Boom, boom, crunch. The sounds were violent, methodical. They weren't inspecting for structural integrity. They were demolishing. They were searching. The vibrations traveled through the floorboards of Agnes's apartment, a terrifying pulse that echoed the frantic beating of Liam's heart. They were tearing down the walls of Isaac's tomb, looking for his last will and testament. Liam knew he had only minutes. He grabbed Maya's hand. "Agnes, the coal chute," he said, his voice urgent. "You said you used a coal chute. Is it still there? Can we get out that way? Agnes nodded, her face ashen. On the north side, it empties into the old boiler room alley, but it's been sealed for years. They're making new holes, Liam said grimly. Maybe they'll make one for us. He raced back down the stairs, Maya stumbling behind him, the weight of the duffel bag throwing him off balance. The sounds of destruction from next door grew louder, more frantic. Smash, crack, boom! It was the sound of a crime being covered up with more crime. He slipped out the side door of the tenement and crept along the shadows of the alley that ran between the two buildings. He had to get back inside the cellar without being seen by the men who were already in there. It was insane, but the main entrance was their only way in. His only hope was that they were too focused on their destructive search to notice him re-entering the tomb. The air was now filled with a fine, gritty dust that stung his eyes and coated his throat. It was the dust of the very walls that had been Isaac's prison, now pulverized in a hunt for his legacy. He reached the heavy steel door he had left slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, he slipped back inside. The scene was a nightmare. The cellar, which had been grim but stable, was now a war zone. The two thugs were moving with brutal efficiency, swinging heavy sledgehammers against the concrete walls in wide, powerful arcs. Chunks of concrete and clouds of thick, choking dust filled the air. The single bare bulb flickered wildly, casting the scene in a strobe-like, hellish light. The men were shouting to each other over the din, their voices rough and guttural. "Nothing here," one yelled, his voice echoing. "Boss said it was in the wall. Keep swinging." They weren't searching, they were annihilating. Liam and Maya were hidden in the deep shadows near the entrance, but the dust was a greater danger than the men. It was thick as fog, a swirling vortex of plaster and mold spores. Maya began to cough, a small, tight sound at first, but it was quickly escalating into a desperate, full-blown asthma attack. Liam's blood ran cold. The dust was suffocating her. Her wheezing was a high-pitched, terrifying whistle. He fumbled for her inhaler, his hands slick with a cold sweat. He administered a puff, but in the thick, particulate-filled air, it had almost no effect. Her eyes were wide with panic, her small body struggling for every single breath. The men hadn't heard them yet over the sound of their own destruction, but it was only a matter of time. They would be found, or Maya would suffocate in the very spot where Isaac Feldman had taken his last breath. A surge of pure primal panic, unlike anything he had ever known, seized Liam. He looked from his gasping daughter to the two brutes smashing the walls, then to the heavy duffel bag in his hand. The gold, the distraction, it was his only play. He looked for the coal chute Agnes had described. High up on the far wall, he saw it. A square of rusted metal, a dark opening now partially visible where a chunk of the wall had been smashed away. It was their only way out. One of the thugs turned, his flashlight beam cutting a swath through the dust cloud, sweeping dangerously close to their hiding spot. "Hey, I thought I heard something," he growled. Liam knew they were out of time. He unzipped the duffel bag, the sound lost in the chaos. He plunged his hand into the cool, heavy mass of the gold coins. He grabbed two huge handfuls, the weight of them a solid, desperate reality in his palms. The other man stopped swinging his hammer. "What? You're hearing things. Let's get this done." They were listening now. The relative quiet was more terrifying than the noise. In that split second of silence, Maya let out a loud, ragged gasp for air. It was over. They were heard. Both men spun around, their flashlight beams pinning Liam and Maya against the wall. "Well, well," the first thug said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Look what we have here." The rat came back to his nest. They started advancing, sledgehammers held loosely in their hands, no longer tools of demolition but brutal, primitive weapons. They were walking slowly, enjoying the moment, two predators cornering their prey. Liam's mind went strangely calm. The terror was replaced by a sharp, icy focus. He knew exactly what he had to do. He looked past the men, toward the darkest, most debris-strewn corridor leading off the main cellar. "Now, Maya!" he screamed, the words tearing from his throat. As the men tensed, startled by his shout, Liam drew back his arm and, with all his might, threw the handfuls of gold coins. They sailed through the dusty air in a glittering arc, landing deep in the far corridor with a loud, cascading clatter of metal on concrete that echoed through the entire basement. It was the sound of a jackpot, a sound no greedy man could ignore. It was the sound of salvation. The effect was instantaneous. Greed trumped orders. The two thugs, their eyes wide with avarice, forgot all about Liam and Maya. "The gold!" one of them yelled, his voice hoarse with excitement. They broke into a frantic scramble, stumbling over each other as they charged into the dark corridor, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly as they began to desperately scoop up the scattered coins. It was the opening Liam needed. He threw the now lighter duffel bag over his shoulder, scooped Maya up into his arms, and ran. He ran toward the far wall, toward the hole where the coal chute was hidden. His legs screamed in protest, but he ignored it. The dust was so thick he could barely see, but he kept Agnes's directions in his mind. North wall, boiler room alley. He reached the spot, a gaping hole where the thugs' sledgehammers had revealed the old metal chute, its surface buckled and rusted. It wasn't a slide. It was a tight vertical drop, a dark, narrow shaft of rusted metal. He didn't hesitate. Holding Maya tight against his chest with one arm, he grabbed the jagged edge of the opening and swung them both inside. The rusted metal tore at his hands, ripping his skin, but he didn't feel the pain. They fell, sliding and tumbling down the dark, narrow space in a cascade of rust flakes and loose debris. The chute was steeper and longer than he expected, a terrifying, blind descent into darkness. They emerged with a jarring thud, landing in a heap on a soft pile of ancient coal dust and rubbish in a small, brick-lined alley. The air was blessedly clean, cold and sharp in his lungs. He gasped, taking in deep, ragged breaths. Above them, he could hear the muffled shouts of the thugs as they realized they had been tricked. They didn't have much time. Liam scrambled to his feet, pulling Maya up with him. She was still coughing, her breathing shallow and strained, but the clean air was already helping. He looked around the narrow alley. It was a dead end, blocked on one side by a high brick wall, but the other way led back out toward the tenement. "Come on, sweetie, almost there," he whispered, his voice raw. He half ran, half limped down the alley, Maya in his arms, the duffel bag bouncing against his back. He burst out of the alley and saw the warm yellow lights of Agnes's building. It looked like the most beautiful sanctuary in the world. He could hear shouting from the factory behind them, the sound of the steel door being thrown open. They had been spotted. With the last of his strength, he sprinted across the open lot, his lungs burning, his leg a useless, dragging weight. He reached the side door of the tenement, threw it open, and stumbled inside, collapsing against the wall in the dim, quiet hallway. He didn't rest. He forced himself back to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He could hear the heavy, running footsteps of the thugs crossing the lot outside. They were coming. He half climbed, half dragged himself and Maya up the 3 flights of stairs, the sound of his own ragged breathing and Maya's panicked wheezing filling the stairwell. He reached the door of 3B and pounded on it with his fist, not waiting for a reply. "Agnes, let us in. They're coming." The world seemed to slow down. He could hear the front door of the tenement slam open downstairs, the heavy boots of the thugs echoing on the linoleum floor. They were inside the building. He heard the clatter of the chain on Agnes's door, and it swung open. He pushed Maya inside and stumbled in after her, turning to slam the door shut, just as the first of the thugs appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of incandescent fury. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy, final-sounding thud. They were safe, for now. The deadbolt slamming home was the loudest sound Liam had ever heard, a metallic boom that sealed them inside Agnes's small, lavender-scented apartment. Outside, the heavy, angry footsteps of Vance's thugs echoed on the stairs, followed by a violent, splintering crash as a fist or a boot hit the door. Maya screamed, burying her face in Liam's dusty jacket. He held her tight, his body a trembling shield, his own heart a frantic drum against her back. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, fear, and the concrete dust that still clung to them like a shroud. Agnes, her face a pale, determined mask, did not hesitate. She shuffled past the rattling door, ignoring the brutal pounding, and lifted the receiver of her ancient black rotary phone. Her fingers, gnarled but steady, dialed a number from memory. "Elena," she said, her voice a thin, wiry command. "It's Agnes." He found it. The journal. "And they are here. The Vances. Send everyone." A long silence. Then, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, came the most beautiful sound in the world. the rising and falling wail of distant sirens, cutting a path of justice through the cold, dark night. The local police were the first to arrive, their blue and red lights painting the tenement's grimy walls in frantic, strobing colors. They apprehended the two thugs, who were still trying to break down Agnes's reinforced door, their faces a mixture of fury and disbelief, but they were just the vanguard. Minutes later, a black sedan pulled up, and a woman stepped out. She was in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, commanding presence that seemed to cut through the chaos. This was Elena Rios, the pro bono human rights lawyer Agnes had called. She moved with a purpose that reassured Liam instantly. Inside the apartment, she listened intently as Liam, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear, recounted the night's events. Agnes stood beside him, a fragile but unshakable pillar of support. When Liam finally pulled the leather-bound journal from his pocket, Elena's professional calm did not waver, but a deep, grim understanding settled in her eyes. She reached for it, not as evidence, but with a quiet reverence, as if she were taking the sworn statement of a ghost who had waited decades to speak. On Agnes's small, lace-covered dining table, the pieces of a 70-year-old crime were laid bare under the warm, yellow light of a single lamp. Elena Rios, wearing thin reading glasses, opened the journal. Her voice was steady as she read a passage aloud, Isaac's elegant, desperate words filling the quiet room. "He is burying his crime. He is burying me. Avenge us." The plea, finally heard, hung in the air with immense weight. Next, a state investigator set up a small camera, and Agnes, her hand resting on a Bible, gave her official testimony. Her voice, thin and trembling, recounted the story of the kind watchmaker, the food passed through the chute, and Arthur Vance's monstrous threat. The final piece of the puzzle was the duffel bag. Liam unzipped it, and the soft, warm glow of the pre-war gold coins spilled out onto the floor. An investigator picked one up, his gloved fingers tracing the faint, foreign markings, the motive, the witness, and the stolen fortune. It was all there, an airtight case, forged in history and sealed in blood, now finally brought into the light. The call to the State Attorney General was brief. The evidence was irrefutable, the living witness testimony unimpeachable. Within the hour, an emergency warrant was issued for the arrest of Marcus Vance. The scene cut across the city to the gleaming, sterile pinnacle of the Vance Tower. In his penthouse office, surrounded by panoramic views of a city built on his family's secrets, Marcus Vance was preparing to host a charity gala. He exuded an aura of untouchable power and philanthropic grace. The illusion was shattered when the doors to his office burst open and a team of state investigators, armed and resolute, swarmed in. "Marcus Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and suspicion of accessory to murder." The arrogance on Vance's face curdled into pure, unadulterated shock, then withered into the pathetic fear of a cornered animal. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed in the cavernous office, a sound of retribution that had been waiting for generations, a final, definitive end to an empire built on bone and lies. The abandoned factory, once a symbol of decay and forgotten industry, became the center of a media firestorm. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the entire block, and satellite trucks from every major news network lined the street. The story was explosive: a respected philanthropic family, a hidden journal, and a dark secret buried in the city's foundations. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights that turned night into day, a team of forensic archaeologists began the grim task. Heavy jackhammers, the same tools of destruction Vance's thugs had used, were now instruments of justice, methodically breaking apart the thick concrete slab of the factory's West Wing foundation. The sound echoed across the lot, a percussive, relentless search for the truth. From the window of Agnes's apartment, Liam watched, Maya asleep in his arms. He felt no triumph, only a profound, bone-deep sadness for the family that had been lost, and a quiet determination to see this through to the end, for their sake. After 2 days of relentless digging, the work suddenly stopped. The roar of the jackhammers was replaced by an almost sacred silence. One of the lead archaeologists, kneeling in the pit, raised a hand. They had found something. The heavy machinery was moved away, and the work became delicate, painstaking. Team members descended into the hole with brushes and small trowels, gently clearing away decades of dirt and debris. An hour later, they were brought out. 2 small, white evidence tents were erected. The public was kept at a distance, but the truth was undeniable. They had found the remains of an adult female and a small child, buried together, their fragile bones intertwined in a final, desperate embrace. Leah and Daniel Feldman had been found. The monstrous truth of Arthur Vance's evil was finally, irrefutably exposed to the world. It was a moment of national mourning and horror, but for the spirit of Isaac Feldman, it was the closing of a circle, a final, heartbreaking reunion in the light of day. Justice, somber and terrible, had been served. The fall of the House of Vance was as swift as it was total, with Marcus Vance's arrest and the forensic evidence confirming the historical crimes. The corporation imploded, its assets were frozen, its board members resigned in disgrace, and its name became a byword for evil. In the complex legal proceedings that followed, the courts had to address the fortune Isaac Feldman had hidden. As no other living heirs could be located after an extensive international search, the legal principle of a finder's fee was applied. In a quiet meeting in her office, Elena Rios slid a document across the table to Liam. It was a court order, awarding him, as the discoverer of the crime and the key to the entire investigation, a substantial portion of the seized Vance assets. The number was astronomical, a figure so large it seemed like a misprint. Liam stared at it, his vision blurring. It wasn't the number that mattered, it was the sound of Maya's future, safe and secure. It was the feeling of a crushing weight, the weight of poverty and fear, lifting from his soul forever. 1 year later, the world was a different color. The gray, unforgiving cityscape had been replaced by the vibrant green of a sprawling lawn. Liam stood on the porch of a bright, sun-drenched house, a gentle breeze carrying the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. The air was clean and warm, a stark contrast to the cold, mold-filled tomb that had once been his only hope. He watched Maya, her cheeks rosy with health, as she chased a monarch butterfly through the garden. Her laughter, clear and effortless, was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. There was no wheezing, no panicked gasping for air. The best doctors and the clean country air had worked their own magic. The constant gnawing fear that had been his companion for so long had vanished, replaced by a quiet, profound sense of peace. He felt his disabled leg, now supported by a custom brace he could finally afford, and felt not pain, but gratitude. He hadn't just found a fortune. He had found a life, the one that had been stolen from him, and had a chance to build it anew. The wealth was a tool, not a prize. Liam knew he had a debt to pay, not to the world, but to the ghost who had made it all possible. He stood at a podium before a new, modern building, its glass facade gleaming in the sun. It was the Isaac and Leah Feldman Center for New Americans, a place he had funded to provide legal aid, language classes, and a safe haven for refugees and immigrants. In his speech, he spoke not of his own journey, but of Isaac's. He held up the original journal, now professionally restored and preserved. "This book," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is not just a story of betrayal. It's a story of a father's love and a desperate hope that justice would one day find its way out of the darkness." In the front row, Agnes Nowak, now 90 years old, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, a proud, brilliant smile on her face. The Feldman name, once erased by a murderer, was now a beacon. Their tragic story transformed into a legacy of hope and welcome for those who, like Isaac, arrived seeking only a chance at life. The story ends where it began, with Liam in a workshop. But this one is his. The air is filled with the clean, sharp scent of cedar and pine, and his new tools gleam on the walls. His hands, once trembling with hunger and despair, are now steady and strong, carving a small, intricate wooden bird. He glances through the window into the house, where a nightlight casts a soft glow on Maya's sleeping face. She is safe. She is healthy. She is home. The gold coins gave them a future, but it was the act of unearthing a forgotten story, of fighting for a justice that was not his own, that had truly healed him. He had found his purpose not in the treasure, but in the truth. The story of Isaac Feldman proves that even from the darkest of tombs, a plea for justice can echo through time. waiting for a soul desperate enough and brave enough to listen. What did you think of Liam's final act of honor? For more stories of incredible discoveries and ultimate redemption, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss a new chapter.